My personal opinion is, in certain circumstances, for certain types of crime, then the death penalty is absolutely justice, natural justice. That isn't going to apply to everything across the board, but I think if you look at generally at people, what people want, that I think this highlights the disconnect between politicians and the people on the street. We do seem let down by our justice system in a massive way, and I think this would kind of redress the balance.
What about miscarriages of justice, though? The Guildford 4, Birmingham 6, Stefan Kisco. People like this would all be dead if you had your way, and they were innocent.
Well, I think now with the technology we have, DNA, etc., I think you're talking some crimes now are so hideous and so heinous, and guilt is not in dispute at all. We can reel the names off: Whiting, Belfield, the two people who murdered Lee Rigby so horribly. I mean, their guilt is not in dispute, and I think to ask the taxpayers to keep them in prison for life is an abomination, and instead we should have a more victim-led and family-led justice system, as opposed to always centred around the perpetrator.
Frances Crook, let me bring you in there from the Howard League for Penal Reform. What's your reaction to that?
Well, a lot of victims and their families, of course, don't want a death on their conscience, another death on their conscience. They don't want to bring back executions. And we all know that there are miscarriages of justice. In the most sophisticated legal system in the world, in America, there are innocent people who have been killed by the state. And so I don't think it helps victims, and I don't think it helps justice.
What about being the ultimate deterrent, though, to make people think twice about committing a crime?
Well, since we abolished executions, we've got a much less violent society. The murder rate has more than halved. We're much less tolerant of violence, and I think that's really important to remember, that we're a much less violent society. So actually, in the very few times when a murder does happen, the majority of those times it's within a family, and it's a very complicated, very distressing situation.
But if
I don't think that talking about executions helps.
If a dreadful crime, though, was committed against someone in your family, maybe a child in your family, do you think you might feel differently?
Well, that's why we have a justice system, but I have worked with lots of families who have experienced the worst kind of tragedy of having a child or a family member murdered, and they've all said clearly they don't want an execution to take place. What they want is...
Well, when the death penalty was abolished, the British people were sold basically something. They were told that life sentence for the most heinous of crimes, people would be incarcerated for life. That is wrong. 1 in 9 life sentences, prisoners who could get convicted and given a life sentence are let out in less than a decade. That is not justice in any way, shape or form. And for child murderers, for serial killers, these kind of hideous, heinous crimes, I'm sorry, natural justice would be the death penalty.
Frances Crook, let me bring you back in.
Well, we have more people serving a life sentence in England and Wales than every other country in Europe, and that's 46 countries put together. We use the life sentence like confetti, and people spend many, many years in prison for things like mercy killing, for domestic killings, which is a one-off and which is an absolute tragedy within the family. Now, of course, people who kill more than once, or people who do the unexplained murders, they do spend many, many years, and sometimes the whole of their natural life in prison.
All these people are concerned about are the human rights of the perpetrator. We must end this. We must let the people decide. There has been no debate about the capital punishment in this country for a decade. We should now debate this in Parliament and put it out to a referendum. That's what we would like to see.
Frances Crook, what do you think about a big new debate about this?
There were a lot of debates in Parliament, repeated debates in Parliament over a decade. And what happened was there were lots of discussions about whether it be for the murder of a police officer or murder of a child, and nobody could agree. And there hasn't been a debate recently because nobody seriously is asking for a return of capital punishment. There are a lot of problems in our prisons and in the justice system, but I think this is a red herring, and I think actually I don't want to return to a violent society.
OK, Frances Crook, there we have to leave it. Many thanks to you for joining us tonight, and of course Louise Bours, thank you very much for joining us.